The first moment I stepped into what I would later recognize as an infested home, nothing looked dramatic. There were no moving shadows, no strange noises, no cinematic signs of something unseen pressing against reality. What I saw instead was something far more unsettling. A normal family quietly coming apart from the inside while still doing everything that, on paper, should have protected them. They prayed the rosary. They attended Mass. They tried to live faithfully. And yet something in that house was steadily eroding their peace, their unity, and their interior strength in a way none of them could explain. Not one of them could point to a single external cause, and that is precisely what made it so serious. Cases like this are not rare in my experience. Over the course of 3 decades, I have encountered families who appear spiritually intact but are internally collapsing without clear psychological or relational triggers. This is not about superstition, and it is not about turning every hardship into a spiritual crisis. Most suffering has natural explanations, and I do not deny that for a moment. But there is also a category of disturbance that does not fit neatly into psychiatric or emotional frameworks alone. It presents as a slow breakdown of what holds a household together, especially its capacity for prayer, trust, and stability. I am speaking now as a Catholic priest formed in traditional Thomistic theology, someone who originally intended to remain in the academic world of philosophy and metaphysics. My early formation was centered on Aquinas, on being, on the nature of the soul, and on the relationship between God and creation. I did not begin with an expectation of confronting these realities in pastoral work. That came later, once I was ordained and began hearing repeated accounts from otherwise rational, grounded people who were experiencing things no medical or psychological explanation fully accounted for. It is important to be precise here. Psychiatry is not the enemy. It is a legitimate field dealing with real conditions of the brain and human behavior. The problem arises when everything is forced exclusively into that framework, leaving no conceptual space for anything beyond it. For several decades in Western clerical formation, especially from the late 20th century onward, the category of genuine demonic activity was largely removed from serious pastoral training. Priests were often directed to interpret all such reports through psychological categories alone, regardless of whether the phenomena fully fit those categories or not. What I learned over time, often through difficult pastoral experience, is that this gap in formation left many people without adequate help, not because every case is demonic, but because some cases are not purely psychological either. The tradition of the Church, especially in the theology of Thomas Aquinas, does not ignore this. It provides a structured framework for understanding how purely spiritual intelligences, specifically fallen angels, can act within the limits permitted by God, often through influence on material and psychological conditions, rather than direct control of the human will. These beings, according to classical Catholic teaching, are not irrational forces. They are intelligent, ordered in their nature, and distorted in their intention. Their intellect remains, but their orientation toward good is lost. That distinction matters because it explains why their activity, when it occurs, often appears strategic rather than chaotic. It is not random disturbance. It tends toward gradual disruption, discouragement, division, and spiritual weakening over time. With that framework in mind, I want to return to the family I mentioned. They were not unusual in the moral sense. A married couple in their 40s, 3 children, stable employment, outwardly practicing Catholics. They had been living in their home for about a year and a half before I was contacted. At first, the symptoms were subtle enough that no one connected them to anything unusual. A sense of heaviness in certain rooms, interrupted sleep, a growing unease that could not be localized. Then the pattern deepened. The eldest child began experiencing nightly distress. The parents, normally stable in their relationship, began arguing without clear subject matter, as if the conflict itself had no identifiable root. Prayer, once consistent in the household, began to feel empty or burdensome. One parent struggled simply to get up for Mass. The other began to doubt whether prayer had any real effect at all. None of this was immediate. It unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly, over months. What stood out most to me was not dramatic manifestation, but erosion, the gradual weakening of spiritual consistency, the loss of interior clarity, and the subtle breakdown of trust within the family unit. In many cases I have seen, Children tend to notice the shift before adults do, because they have not yet learned to rationalize away what they experience. When I was finally called to the home, I brought with me what the church uses in these situations: sacramentals and, more importantly, the Eucharistic presence reserved in a portable manner for blessing and discernment. I walked through the house carefully, observing not only the physical environment, but the interior reactions that sometimes accompany proximity to spiritually disturbed places. There was no spectacle, only a growing sense of resistance as I moved through certain areas of the home. The strongest impression came in the lower level, the basement. It was not fear in the emotional sense, but a kind of alertness, as if one becomes aware of something present that does not belong there. The space itself felt spiritually dense, for lack of a better term, though nothing outwardly suggested anything unusual. In one corner, on a shelf left by previous occupants, were several objects the family had not paid attention to. Among them was a wooden board, later identified as a Ouija board, and beside it a set of tarot cards wrapped in cloth. Neither had been used by the family. They were simply there, unnoticed, left behind, and forgotten. At that moment, the case began to take a clearer shape, because certain objects, especially those associated with deliberate attempts at divination or contact with non-material intelligences, are not spiritually neutral in the tradition I was formed in. They are not treated as harmless curiosities, even if the intention of the user was casual or uninformed. And what I found in that basement would become the starting point for understanding why this household, despite every outward appearance of faithfulness, was experiencing a collapse they could not explain. The question that always comes next in cases like this is whether something as simple as forgotten objects in a basement can truly correspond to something as serious as spiritual disturbance in an entire household. From a purely material perspective, it sounds impossible. A wooden board, a set of cards, items left behind by previous occupants, none of it appears significant on its own. And yet, in the tradition I was formed in, the concern is never about the material appearance alone, but about the type of act that object is designed to facilitate. A Ouija board is not treated in Catholic theology as a decorative game in the same category as ordinary household items. Its purpose, regardless of how casually it is marketed in modern consumer culture, is to function as a tool for attempting communication with hidden intelligences. Whether a person believes in that communication or not does not change the nature of the act being performed. The same applies, in a related but distinct way, to objects used for divination, such as tarot cards, when they are employed with the intention of seeking hidden knowledge or guidance from non-natural sources. It is important to avoid misunderstanding here. The Church does not teach that every physical object carries spiritual danger, nor does it encourage fear of ordinary life. The distinction is not between safe objects and dangerous objects, but between ordinary use and specific intentional acts that fall under the category of divination or spiritual invocation. In the theological framework of Thomas Aquinas, divination is not simply curiosity about the future. It is defined as seeking knowledge through means outside the order established by God, which can involve a disorder in the will, and in certain cases, openness to influences beyond the purely natural order. When I explained this to the family, I was careful not to exaggerate or create panic. Most of the time, people assume that any mention of spiritual influence automatically implies dramatic manifestations or immediate possession. That is not what I was describing. The more common reality, by far, is subtle influence, gradual weakening of prayer life, increased internal conflict, emotional heaviness, and confusion that does not correspond to identifiable external causes. These effects are not theatrical. They are quiet and persistent, which is part of what makes them difficult to recognize. The family in this case had not used the objects. They had not engaged in any rituals. They had not even been aware of what was stored in their basement. That detail is important because it removes the assumption of deliberate involvement. In many cases I have encountered, people assume that only intentional participation matters. But the theological concern is not only about explicit intent, it is also about exposure to acts and objects associated with spiritual practices that fall outside Christian worship, especially when those objects are treated as ordinary and left unexamined in a living space. At this point, I want to step back and clarify the reasoning process, because this is where misunderstanding often begins. The claim is not that an object contains a spirit in the way a container holds water. That would be a misunderstanding of Catholic teaching. The more precise idea is that certain acts can establish a form of association or claim that is not material, but relational in a spiritual sense. In classical language, this is sometimes described as a foothold or point of access, not because matter itself is transformed into something supernatural, but because actions can open a person or environment to influences that are not purely natural. This is also why the response of the Church is never limited to removal alone. When such objects are identified, the typical pastoral response includes both their removal and a structured prayer of blessing over the home, along with sacramental practices such as confession, prayer of renunciation, and consecration of the household to Christ. The emphasis is not on panic, but on restoration of proper spiritual order. In this case, once the objects were identified, I advised their removal and destruction outside the home with appropriate prayer. Again, the focus was not on the physical act of destruction itself, but on what the Church understands as the reordering of the household, away from anything associated with spiritual ambiguity or non-Christian invocation. The family agreed, though with understandable skepticism. The father in particular approached the situation like a rational experiment, which is a response I have seen many times. He was not hostile, only cautious, and wanted to see whether any meaningful change would follow. Alongside the removal of the objects, I carried out a blessing of the home using sacramentals, holy water, blessed salt, and prayers drawn from the Church's liturgical tradition. The purpose of these actions is not symbolic in a vague sense, but sacramental in the Catholic understanding. They are means through which grace is requested and applied in a structured way to persons and places. The home was also formally dedicated to Christ, with specific prayers of consecration, and the family participated in the rosary together that evening. What is often overlooked in discussions like this is that the immediate spiritual discipline of the household matters as much as any external intervention. The return to structured prayer, especially communal prayer, reestablishes a pattern of spiritual coherence within the family. In Catholic understanding, the domestic church is not just a metaphor. It is the idea that the home participates in the life of the larger church through prayer, sacrament, and moral order. Within days of these actions, the family reported a noticeable shift. The first change was not dramatic relief, but absence, the absence of the heaviness they had grown accustomed to. The mother described it as if a constant background pressure had lifted. The father noted that his difficulty waking for Mass, which he had previously experienced as a kind of internal resistance, no longer felt present in the same way. The children, who are often more sensitive to environmental shifts, stopped reporting disturbances during the night. From a cautious perspective, one could interpret this as psychological relief following decisive action. That interpretation is not unreasonable, and I do not reject it outright. Human psychology is deeply responsive to perceived resolution of conflict. However, what I have observed repeatedly in similar cases is that when both sacramental action and removal of specific objects occur together, the consistency of improvement tends to be more stable than when only one of those elements is present. 2 months later, I followed up with the family. Their account remained consistent. The sense of fragmentation that had marked their earlier experience had not returned. Prayer life had stabilized. Communication within the family had improved. The household, by their description, felt normal again, in a way they could clearly recognize by contrast with what had come before. It is at this point that I want to expand the discussion beyond this single case, because the objects in that basement were not unique. In fact, they represent only one category among several that I have repeatedly encountered in my pastoral work. The more difficult cases are not always the obvious ones, like divination tools. There are other, less visible forms of exposure that do not immediately raise concern in modern households, but which, in accumulated cases, show similar patterns of spiritual destabilization. The first of these less obvious categories involves inherited or ancestral items connected to explicit spiritual covenants. The second involves certain forms of media or content that are not merely dark in tone, but intentionally framed as spiritual invocation or ritual practice. The third involves habitual moral disorder, particularly when it becomes unconfessed and persistent over time, shaping the interior life of a person in ways that weaken spiritual resilience. And the fourth involves generational patterns that are rarely acknowledged but repeatedly appear in pastoral cases involving long-standing spiritual distress within families. Each of these requires careful explanation because none of them operate in isolation, and none of them should be reduced to superstition. The key point, which I will continue to develop, is that the Church's understanding of spiritual vulnerability is structured, not random. It is not about fear of objects. It is about recognizing how human actions, repeated over time, shape the openness or resistance of a person and a household to influences beyond the purely natural order. And once that framework is understood clearly, the rest of the pattern becomes easier to recognize. What becomes more important at this stage is not the objects themselves, but the pattern they reveal when placed inside a broader context. In my experience, people often fixate on the most visible item, the board, the cards, the artifact. But the real issue is rarely confined to a single object. It is the relationship between human behavior, repeated actions, and the gradual shaping of a household's spiritual environment over time. When I speak about this, I am not speaking in symbolic terms. I am describing a consistent pastoral observation made across many years, in many different places, with many different families, who have no connection to one another. The details vary, but the structure of the breakdown often follows a recognizable pattern: an initial period of normal life, followed by subtle disturbances, then emotional and relational instability, and finally a loss of interior coherence that affects prayer, communication, and peace within the home. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this is the role of intention. People often assume that only deliberate engagement with the occult produces any form of spiritual consequence. But the tradition I am working from draws a distinction between subjective intention and objective moral structure of actions. A person may act without full understanding, without belief, or without serious intent, yet still participate in an action that belongs to a category the Church considers spiritually disordered. This does not automatically produce dramatic effects, but it can contribute to vulnerability over time. This is why cases involving ignorance are often more complex than cases involving deliberate intent. A person who consciously rejects spiritual reality is, in a sense, at least aware of the boundary they are crossing. But a person who casually enters into practices without understanding their meaning may repeatedly open themselves to influences they do not recognize as significant. In pastoral practice, it is this second category that appears most frequently. In the family I described earlier, the important point was not that they had engaged in anything, but that they had unknowingly allowed certain objects to remain within their living environment without discernment. That lack of discernment is not a moral accusation. It is simply a fact of modern life, where people inherit homes, purchase properties, or move into spaces without any awareness of what may have been used there previously. When I entered the basement and identified the objects, my immediate concern was not emotional reaction, but pastoral clarity. The first task in any situation like this is to separate speculation from structure. Emotional interpretation tends to exaggerate or minimize reality, depending on the person. The Church's approach, at least in traditional practice, is to proceed step by step. Identify possible sources of disturbance, remove potential points of concern, restore sacramental order, and observe whether the household stabilizes. What followed in this case was not immediate transformation in a dramatic sense, but a noticeable reduction in internal tension within the home. This is an important distinction. Many people expect either nothing to change or everything to change instantly. In reality, the process is often gradual and measured. The absence of disturbance becomes more noticeable than any single event. During my conversation with the family, I emphasized something that is often overlooked: the role of ordinary spiritual discipline. Regular prayer, participation in the sacraments, and the moral structure of daily life are not secondary elements in Catholic life. They are foundational. When these elements weaken, the interior stability of a person and a household becomes more fragile, regardless of any external factors. This is where the concept of the domestic church becomes essential. In Catholic theology, the family is not simply a social unit. It is a place where faith is lived, transmitted, and protected. The father, the mother, and the children each participate in this structure in different but complementary ways. When that structure is intact, it provides a natural resilience against many forms of spiritual and psychological instability. When it is weakened, the household becomes more susceptible to disorder, whether natural or otherwise. In the modern context, this structure has been significantly disrupted. The decline of regular sacramental practice, the weakening of catechetical formation, and the fragmentation of family life have all contributed to a situation where many Catholics are no longer fully aware of the spiritual framework in which their lives are meant to be lived. This is not a matter of blame, but of observation. The family in this case began to recover not only through the removal of the objects, but through the restoration of routine spiritual practice. The rosary was prayed again in a consistent way. Confession was scheduled. The home was no longer treated as a neutral space, but as a place intentionally oriented toward God. These actions, while simple, are not insignificant in Catholic understanding. They reestablish order where disorder had quietly developed. It is also important to understand that not every case resolves so clearly. I have seen households where similar steps were taken and the recovery was partial or slower. I have also seen cases where psychological or relational issues were the dominant factor and spiritual interventions alone were not sufficient to address the underlying problem. That is why discernment is essential. The Church does not treat every case as identical, nor does it assume a single explanation for all forms of distress. One of the more difficult aspects of this work is maintaining balance between two errors, dismissing everything as purely natural on one side and attributing everything to supernatural causes on the other. Both extremes fail to represent the complexity of human experience. The task is to discern carefully, without rushing to conclusions. In this case, what stood out most was not any single event, but the cumulative pattern of restoration following structured intervention. Whether one interprets that primarily through psychological stabilization or through spiritual correction depends on one's framework. The Church's position allows for both natural and supernatural causality to operate without contradiction, since they do not occupy the same explanatory level. As the days passed, the family reported that life in the home had become more stable and predictable. The emotional volatility that had characterized earlier months was no longer present. The children returned to normal sleep patterns. The parents' relationship, while not suddenly transformed into perfection, regained clarity and communication that had been missing during the period of disturbance. What is important here is not to exaggerate the outcome, but to recognize the structure of resolution. In Catholic pastoral theology, grace does not override nature. It restores and elevates it. That means healing is often experienced as a return to order rather than the introduction of something entirely new. Before concluding this part of the account, I want to address a misconception that often arises when these topics are discussed publicly. People tend to assume that if spiritual influence is real, then fear should be the appropriate response. That is not the position of the Church. Fear is not the foundation of Christian life. Grace is. The proper response to any awareness of spiritual vulnerability is not anxiety, but ordered action, confession, prayer, sacramental participation, and moral clarity. These are not defensive mechanisms in a psychological sense. They are participations in a life that is already oriented toward God. There is a point in these cases where the discussion must move beyond obvious objects and into the more subtle categories that most people do not immediately associate with spiritual disturbance. In my experience, these are often the areas where misunderstanding is greatest, because they overlap with ordinary life so closely that they rarely trigger concern. Yet over time, they can form part of a broader pattern that affects the interior stability of a household. One of the first of these less obvious categories is inherited material connected to past spiritual commitments. This does not mean that every inherited item carries significance. Rather, it refers to specific cases where objects are tied to formal or explicit religious or quasi-religious covenants made outside the Christian faith. In such cases, the concern is not sentimentality or family history, but the nature of the original act associated with the object. In pastoral work, I have encountered situations where items such as jewelry, documents, or ceremonial objects were retained in households without any awareness of their original context. In some cases, these objects were connected to initiatory rituals in organizations that make explicit spiritual claims outside Christian doctrine. The Church has consistently taught that certain forms of initiation or covenantal oath-taking can involve serious spiritual implications, not because of superstition, but because of the nature of freely chosen spiritual alignment. Freemasonry is often discussed in this context, particularly in its historical and doctrinal conflicts with Catholic teaching. Without entering into polemics, the Church has maintained clear boundaries regarding participation in organizations whose rituals and oaths involve commitments that are not compatible with Christian faith. When objects associated with such commitments remain in a home, the concern is not that the object itself has independent power, but that it represents a connection to a past spiritual framework that has not been formally renounced. A second category that is frequently misunderstood involves media and entertainment that crosses the line from artistic expression into explicit ritual framing. It is important to be careful here, because not all depictions of darkness are spiritually significant in this sense. Literature, film, and music have long explored themes of evil, suffering, and moral struggle. That is not the issue. The issue arises when content is explicitly designed or used as an invocation, where the intention is not representation, but participation in or alignment with spiritual forces outside Christian understanding. In rare but documented cases, individuals involved in such content have explicitly described their work in ritual or invocation terms. When such material becomes a central part of a household's environment, especially when consumed habitually and without discernment, it can contribute to a gradual reshaping of interior disposition. This is not immediate or dramatic, but incremental, affecting imagination, emotional tone, and spiritual attentiveness over time. A third category, which is more widespread, involves habitual moral disorder, particularly in the area of sexuality. This must be approached carefully and without sensationalism. The Church's teaching on human sexuality is not arbitrary, but grounded in a theological understanding of the human person. When sexual behavior becomes detached from its proper moral and relational context and is instead reduced to habitual consumption, especially through pornography, it does not remain a neutral act in the interior life of a person. From a pastoral perspective, what is often observed is not a sudden effect, but a gradual weakening of interior discipline, clarity of thought, and capacity for sustained prayer. This weakening does not mean possession or external influence in every case. It refers instead to a kind of interior fragmentation, where the person becomes less able to maintain spiritual focus and moral stability. In cases where other vulnerabilities are present, this fragmentation can become part of a larger pattern of disturbance. It is essential to emphasize that this is not about condemning individuals who struggle in this area. The Church's response is always oriented toward healing through confession and grace. The sacrament of reconciliation is not symbolic. It is understood as a real restoration of spiritual order. When received regularly and sincerely, it plays a central role in stabilizing the interior life of a person. The fourth category involves what can be described as generational or familial spiritual patterns. This is perhaps the most complex area, because it intersects with psychology, sociology, and theology. It refers to cases where certain patterns of spiritual instability appear repeatedly within families across generations, often without a clear external cause in the present moment. In some of these cases, there is evidence of past spiritual commitments made by ancestors that were never formally addressed or renounced. In others, there are long-standing patterns of moral disorder, violence, or spiritual neglect that shape the environment in which later generations are formed. The Church does not reduce these patterns to simple causation, but it does recognize that family structures carry real continuity, both natural and spiritual, that can influence present conditions. It is important not to interpret this in a fatalistic way. The Church does not teach that individuals are bound irreversibly by the actions of their ancestors. Rather, it teaches that grace can interrupt and heal what has been damaged or disordered over time. The sacraments, particularly baptism, confession, and the Eucharist, are understood as real means of breaking continuity with sin and restoring spiritual freedom. In the case I have been describing, none of these deeper categories were the primary focus of the immediate intervention. The initial concern remained the physical objects identified in the basement and the restoration of sacramental order within the home. However, in explaining the broader framework to the family, I made clear that what they were experiencing did not exist in isolation. It was part of a larger pattern that I have seen repeatedly in different forms. What matters most in these situations is not speculation, but response. The Church does not ask people to become preoccupied with identifying every possible source of spiritual vulnerability. Instead, it directs attention toward consistent practices that strengthen spiritual life: regular confession, participation in the Eucharist, prayer within the family, and moral clarity in daily decisions. When these elements are present, the household becomes more stable. When they are absent or irregular, instability becomes more likely, regardless of whether any external spiritual factors are involved. This is why the Church consistently emphasizes formation and sacramental life over fear or fixation on extraordinary phenomena. In the family under discussion, the longer-term outcome was not defined by any single dramatic moment, but by the gradual reestablishment of order. Prayer returned to a consistent place in the home. Relationships stabilized. The sense of internal fragmentation that had characterized their earlier experience diminished over time. Whether one interprets this primarily in spiritual or psychological terms, the observable pattern was one of restoration. What ultimately becomes clear after years of observing cases like the one I have described is that the most important factor is not the presence of extraordinary phenomena, but the structure of ordinary life itself. When people hear discussions about spiritual disturbance, they often expect something dramatic or visually unmistakable. But in practice, the more consistent pattern is subtle erosion rather than sudden rupture, a slow weakening of the internal order that sustains peace, clarity, and unity within a household. This is why the Church's traditional approach is not centered on fascination with unusual events, but on stability. The sacramental life exists precisely to maintain that stability over time. Confession restores what has been damaged through sin. The Eucharist strengthens the soul through union with Christ. Prayer orders the mind and will toward God. These are not optional devotional additions. They are the normal structure of Catholic life, as it was historically understood. In the case I have been describing, what changed the situation was not curiosity about hidden causes, but a return to that structure. Once the objects were removed and the home was reoriented toward sacramental life, the observable disturbances began to diminish. It is important to say this carefully, because the Church does not teach that every problem has a single cause or a single solution. Human psychology, relational dynamics, physical health, and spiritual life all interact in complex ways. However, what stands out in repeated pastoral experience is that when spiritual order is restored, other forms of disorder often become less intense or more manageable. This does not eliminate the need for psychological or medical understanding where appropriate. Rather, it acknowledges that human beings are unified creatures, and that the interior life has consequences that are not purely psychological or purely physical. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this entire subject is fear. Many people, when they first encounter discussions of spiritual influence or disturbance, respond with anxiety. That reaction is understandable, but it is not the response the Church intends to cultivate. Fear is not a stable foundation for spiritual life. The Christian tradition consistently directs attention away from fear and toward disciplined action rooted in grace. Disciplined action in this context means consistency rather than intensity. It means regular confession rather than sporadic crisis response. It means daily prayer rather than occasional urgency. It means living in a way that does not open unnecessary disorder into the interior life. When these practices are present, the question of extraordinary disturbance becomes far less central, because the ordinary structure of life itself provides protection. In the family case, what they experienced after the intervention was not a sudden transformation into an idealized version of life, but a return to normal functioning. Sleep stabilized, communication became clearer. Prayer no longer felt heavy or inaccessible. These are not dramatic outcomes in the popular sense, but they are significant in the lived reality of a household. Peace is often recognized only in its absence, and its return is usually quiet. It is also important to address the role of interpretation. People naturally want to assign meaning to suffering or disruption, and in many cases they will gravitate toward either purely natural explanations or purely spiritual explanations. The Church resists both reductions. It acknowledges that natural causes are real and sufficient in many cases, while also affirming that spiritual realities are not excluded from the created order. This balanced approach is essential, because without it, people either become dismissive of anything they cannot immediately measure, or they become overly suspicious of every difficulty they experience. Neither position reflects a mature understanding of human life. Discernment is the key principle, and discernment requires formation, patience, and humility. In pastoral practice, one of the most important tasks is helping people return to that balance. When someone is suffering, the first question is never, what extraordinary cause is behind this, but rather, what is actually happening in the concrete details of this situation? Only after that is established can deeper questions be responsibly considered. In many cases, the answer remains entirely within natural explanation. In some cases, it does not. But assumptions must always be avoided. What I have tried to communicate through this entire account is not a call to fear, but a call to clarity. The modern world often removes spiritual language entirely from serious consideration, leaving people without categories to understand certain experiences when they arise. At the same time, there is also a tendency in some circles to over-attribute spiritual causes to ordinary human problems. The Church's tradition exists precisely to navigate between these extremes. The domestic church, meaning the family, remains the primary context in which this balance is lived. When the family is formed in prayer, sacramental life, and moral order, it develops resilience that is not easily disrupted by external influences, whether psychological or otherwise. When that structure is weakened, the household becomes more vulnerable to confusion and instability of various kinds. This is why the Church has always emphasized formation at the level of the family. It is not simply about individual spirituality, but about creating a stable environment in which human life can flourish. The erosion of that environment in modern culture is one of the most significant pastoral challenges of the present time, regardless of how one interprets specific cases of disturbance. Returning once more to the family in question, I did not leave them with a sense of fear or preoccupation with hidden threats. That would have been counterproductive. Instead, the focus was on restoring normal Catholic life in the home and maintaining it consistently. Over time, that consistency is what matters most. Not intensity, not extraordinary measures, but fidelity to ordinary means of grace. When I reflect on cases like this after many years, what remains consistent is not the presence of unusual objects or events, but the importance of how people respond once something is recognized as disordered. The difference between escalation and resolution often lies not in the initial condition, but in the response to it. In conclusion, what I have described is not a system of fear, but a framework of discernment rooted in Catholic theology. It recognizes that human beings are both natural and spiritual, and that life cannot be fully understood if either dimension is ignored. It emphasizes sacramental life as the primary means of maintaining order, and it places extraordinary phenomena in their proper context, neither denied nor exaggerated. For those who encounter similar situations, the guidance is not complicated, even if it is demanding. Live in a state of grace, remain consistent in prayer, participate regularly in the sacraments, and avoid unnecessary exposure to practices or objects that belong to spiritual frameworks outside the Christian tradition. Beyond that, trust that God governs reality more fully than any disturbance within it.